John Dun Scotus. Little background for him. First, he was born around 1266 in Scotland and died in 1308, and is of course still dead today. He was a member of the Franciscan order. He studied at Oxford and Paris, and then lectured and wrote at Oxford, Paris, and Cologne. Now, John Dun Scotus is someone that you've heard of, or at least something about him you've heard of, but you may not realize it. He had many followers in his time who were called duncemen or dunces. Now you might wonder why people would go around calling themselves dunces. However, the name did not have a negative connotation back then. The term dunce has come to mean someone dull and ignorant because the followers of John Dun Scotus were referred to as duncemen or dunces, and they and their philosophical views, which are known as scholasticism, were regarded by the thinkers of the Enlightenment as barriers to intellectual development, and hence they were regarded as dull and ignorant people. And hence to this day, it is common to refer to people as dunces to insult their intelligence. We now turn to his view of moral philosophy. Now, in terms of classifying John Dun Scotus, he is in contrast with St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas regarded the intellect as the higher, the nobler aspect of the soul, and hence he subscribed to intellectualism, the view that God's intellect guides and determines his will. Scotus disagreed with Aquinas in this matter. He regarded the will as higher and nobler, and hence the will was superior to the intellect, and so God could will anything, even things that would seem impossible to one's or God's intellect. Now, why accept this? Well, Scotus gives a variety of arguments for the will, which goes as follows. First, he contends that knowledge is an instrument of the will, and the intellect is something like a servant. It brings to the will information and alternatives, like a minion might bring one a selection of, things to choose from in terms of like meals or whatever minions might bring one. And the will selects between them. And so the intellect is a servant to the will because the intellect merely brings options to the will, but the will decides. He also contends that the will can move the intellect. That is to say, we can choose what we think about, which shows to his satisfaction that the will is superior to the intellect. His third line of reasoning is this. He claims the will is free and cannot be determined by anything, not even the intellect. This is in contrast with Aquinas' view. Aquinas held the sort of classical Greek view that we, of necessity, will what we regard as the highest good. Essentially, that one just does this, that the highest good is what is willed, and that's that. Scotus, though, disagrees. He claims the will is not determined by knowledge of the good, but only chooses the good as a result of a free decision. Hence, the will is superior to the intellect. Now, lastly, he contends the intellect is determined by the object of knowledge. That is, it is set by what is known, while the will accepts or rejects what is before it. So hence, the will is superior to the intellect. So based on those reasons, Scotus accepts and claims that the will is superior to the intellect, hence he accepts voluntarism, the idea that God's will is superior to his intellect. Now, this connects to the morality in the following way. As we saw with our good dead friend Thomas Aquinas, he regarded that morality, at least natural morality, is based on a natural inclination to seek happiness, like Aristotle's view. Scotus, though, takes the somewhat depressing view that morality might require us to engage in actions that actually interfere with our happiness. And so as he sees it, moral obligations depend only on God's commands, not on our happiness. So whatever God commands is what we must do morally, even if doing so makes us unhappy. Now Aquinas also believed that the moral law could be found by studying human nature. We could see in our nature, in the nature of the world, what we should do. Scotus disagrees. He held that there was no natural way to determine moral truths. So, because of this, we can't use our reason to tell what's good or bad. Now, why does this work this way? How does this tie into God? Well, given that Scotus accepts voluntarism, as he sees it, God's actions are determined by God's will and not by his reason. Why think this? Well, it's the usual argument. God is supposed to be free and omnipotent. So his will is such that it's all-powerful, and he takes all-powerful to mean that he could will anything. So he's not limited by reason. So, because of this, reason can't tell us what are God's purposes or infer his actions through what are known as a priori means. A priori means, in this case, what is a priori is known through pure reason. For example, take a common example. You can know how many sides a triangle has, even if you don't see it. So, for example, if I say I'm drawing a triangle now, you don't have to wonder, gosh, I wonder what he's drawing or how many sides there are on it. You would know. I'm drawing a three-sided figure from drawing a triangle. That's known by pure reason. So as Scotus sees it, we can't know God's purposes or what his actions are by reason. Why? Well, because everything is contingent on God's will. He can will whatever he wishes. He can will anything. So there's no rational necessity to the world. In other words, there's nothing that must be. And so the world could be completely different. Now, why think that this is true? Well, Scotus gives the following argument. If God's choices were logically necessary, he claims, we could figure out the world by reason, just like we could figure out a logical proof, or a mathematical proof, or a geometric proof, because they're, as Scotus sees it, logically necessary. We can't do this. We can't determine, at least according to Scotus, determine the nature of the world by pure reason. So, since we can't do this, God was free when he created the world, and the created world is entirely contingent. It could be any way that God willed it. Now, not surprisingly, other philosophers, such as René Descartes, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and others, believe the opposite, namely that God's choices are logically necessary, and the world can be sorted out by pure reason, at least in part. For example, in the case of René Descartes, he believes you could go from the claim, I think, therefore I am, and infer all kinds of stuff. So, for Aquinas, God is free in his act of creation, and this is shown by the fact that according to him, we can't determine the nature of the world by pure reason, so God must be free, therefore voluntarism, as Scotus sees it, must be true. So then, is there anything that kind of limits God a bit? Well, Scotus does say the command to love God is the only moral law that's concerned with intrinsic good, that is, something that is good in and of itself. All other actions are good because they are commanded by God. Take, for example, the Ten Commandments. As Scotus sees it, the first set of commands in the Ten Commandments are actually necessary moral truths based on God's self-love. These are, have no other gods before the one true God, not to make any graven images, not to take the Lord's name in vain, and to keep the Sabbath holy. These commands, according to Scotus, fall from God's self-love, and it would be self-contradictory for him to not make these commands. And if there is any natural law, for Scotus, it's in those 4 commandments. The other 6, don't kill, don't lie, don't get caught, etc., those are the result of his will, and are not rationally necessary. He could will anything. He could presumably will the opposite, kill, lie, etc. These are to be obeyed, not because reason tells us they're correct or right, but because God commands them. And since God is completely free in his willing, he could have willed their opposite. So that's Scotus's reasoning as to why divine command theory is correct and should be accepted. Next we'll turn to some problems with divine command theory.